Before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And feel free to share this video with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. The sun had not yet crested the serrated horizon of the northern ridge when Elena pushed her crampons deeper into the brittle crust of the slope. Dawn on Everest's north face came slowly, hesitantly, as if even the light itself needed time to breathe in the thin air. The sky above her was a washed-out steel blue, the color of cold metal kissed by frost, and every movement she made felt accompanied by the distant hum of her own pulse. At nearly 8,000 meters, she was in that strange threshold the mountaineers called the death zone, though she refused to let the term haunt her thoughts. Labels never changed reality, she told herself. Conditions did. And today the conditions, at least for the moment, held. Her breath rasped inside her mask in short, controlled bursts. She had trained for years to master this rhythm, to ease her body into the unnatural cadence of high-altitude breathing. Even so, there were needles pricking behind her eyes and her legs felt heavy, as though the mountain were anchoring her to itself with invisible chains. She lifted her head, counted the steps toward the next anchor point, and forced her mind into the narrow focus that let her continue. The world had shrunk to a sequence of mechanical motions. Plant foot, check stability, shift weight, breathe, repeat. Each movement deliberate, each breath a small triumph. Ahead of her, the slope rose in a white sweep that vanished into a plume of spindrift. Somewhere above that, her climbing partner Daniel was moving at his own steady pace. She couldn't see him, but now and then the radio crackled softly in her pack, reminding her she wasn't entirely alone on the face of the world's highest mountain. They were connected by equipment, by intention, and by the thin thread of trust that formed between two people who had chosen to stake their lives on the same objective. She paused for a moment, shifted her weight, and looked down. Below her stretched the vast Tibetan plateau, a desolate ocean of stone and ice. Far to the west, unseen in the muted light, lay the roads she had traveled, the towns she had crossed, the valleys where she had first learned to climb. The memory of those early climbs flickered in her mind, sun-warmed granite, thick green forests, laughter between old friends. Here everything was stripped bare, reduced to necessity. But that was part of why she had come. Everest demanded the most disciplined version of a climber. It stripped away pretension as efficiently as it stripped oxygen from the air. She resumed her ascent, careful, unhurried. The snow here was hard, its surface glazed by wind, and her crampons bit into it with a dry crack. She moved into a narrow couloir, a steep, natural channel in the slope where the mountain funneled wind and snow. In this sheltered space, the air felt strangely still, and it was there, in the muted quiet between gusts, that something caught her eye. A tiny glint, a flash of reflected light that didn't belong to the chaotic patterns of ice or sun. She blinked, looked again. The glint remained a sharp, precise gleam, like light reflected from a polished surface. For a second she wondered whether it was simply a trick of angle or fatigue. Mirages were not unusual at altitude. The mind, starved of oxygen, invented illusions with surprising ease. But the glint was too real, too clean. She angled her body toward it, stepping sideways across the couloir, testing each foothold carefully. When she reached a more stable position, she crouched and leaned in. Half embedded in the blue-tinged ice was a dark angular object. She narrowed her eyes, studying the shape, the edges, the way the ice clung to it. It didn't resemble a rock. It didn't resemble a piece of modern climbing gear. It looked old. Curiosity overpowered caution for a moment. She tested her stance, drove her ice axe firmly into the wall beside her, and removed one of her gloves. The cold hit her instantly, a biting sensation that threatened to numb her fingers. She ignored it and chipped away delicately at the ice around the object. Shards broke free, skittering down the slope. After a minute of careful work, the item loosened enough for her to pull it free. It was a camera, a heavy, boxy model, unmistakably mid-century. Her heart thumped once, hard, as she turned it over in her hands. The casing was metal, thick and worn. Scratches crossed its surface, scars from time or from impact, she couldn't tell which. She brushed away a thin layer of frost and saw faint markings on the side. Numbers, barely legible, inscribed in a style that felt archaic. 1954. She stared at the date for a long second, letting the implications settle. How long had this been here? 70 years. And whose hands had last held it? A camera on Everest was not unusual in itself. But here, on this remote section of the North Face, in a place few modern climbers approached, it was more than an artifact. It was a fragment of a lost story. She lifted the camera closer to her mask, listening. There was a faint rattle inside, not the hollow sound of a broken mechanism, but something more delicate, a light metallic click. A roll of film. Her pulse quickened. Film from 1954, frozen for decades. If it had survived, if it had captured images in its final minutes, it could contain the last record of a vanished expedition. 1,000 thoughts collided in her mind, but she forced herself to slow down. She couldn't open it here. The cold could destroy whatever was inside. She needed to keep it safe, warm it slowly later. She made herself breathe steadily through the rush of adrenaline. Only then did she notice something else. A cord tied around the camera's grip. Old, frayed, the sort of climbing rope that had long since fallen out of use. She followed its line with her eyes and froze. The cord stretched across the couloir and disappeared into a narrow fissure in the ice. A crevasse, thin but deep. She edged closer, careful not to disturb the unstable snow around it, and peered in. The crevasse swallowed the rope completely, its depths too dark to see more than a meter or two. She tugged very gently on the rope. It was taut. Something heavy lay far below, beyond her sight. The discovery sent a tremor through her. Objects didn't last long in these conditions unless they were shielded from avalanche, wind, and shifting ice. For the rope to remain intact, something must have preserved it in the depths. She imagined the old expedition men in wool jackets and leather boots, climbing with primitive gear compared to today's standards. Men whose names she had read in history books, whose fates remained uncertain. Had this camera belonged to one of them? Had he fallen into the crevasse? Had the rope kept him suspended? Had the ice entombed him within moments? She exhaled slowly, pushing the thoughts aside. Assumptions misled climbers. Only evidence mattered. As she steadied herself, something else drew her attention. A mark in the snow a short distance away, near the lip of the couloir. A shape that didn't match natural patterns of wind or ice. She stepped toward it, forcing her tired legs to cooperate. When she reached it, she realized it was a footprint. A single footprint. It was faint, partially softened by drifting snow, but its edges still held enough definition to confirm what it was. She crouched, studying it. The size suggested a human boot. The shape was recent enough to retain its outline. But what unsettled her most was the absence of any trail leading to or from it. No other prints, no drag marks, nothing. As if someone had stood in that spot briefly, just long enough to leave an impression, and then vanished. Her radio crackled suddenly, startling her. Daniel's voice came through, distorted by static. "Elena, you've been stopped for a while. Everything all right?" She looked from the camera in her hand to the crevasse, then to the lonely footprint. Her instinct told her not to mention the footprint yet. She wasn't ready to explain what she didn't understand. "I found something," she said. "An old piece of gear. I'm checking it." There was a pause. She imagined Daniel watching his own ascent, balancing concern and trust. Then he spoke again, and this time his tone carried a thread of unease. "Are you sure you're alone down there? My tracker shows—" "I don't know. It's picking up another signal near you. Could be a glitch." Elena felt the cold differently then, as if it reached deeper beneath her clothing. She turned slowly, scanning the slope again, searching for movement or shape. The wind had stilled for the moment, leaving the mountain eerily quiet. "I don't see anyone," she said. "Strange. The signal's faint, but it's close. Right on top of you almost." She tightened her grip on the camera, forcing her mind to stay grounded. GPS interference wasn't uncommon near steep faces. Signals bounced. Devices malfunctioned in the cold. She knew all this. Still, her heartbeat quickened. "Probably just the terrain," she said. "Ice can reflect signals." Maybe, Daniel said. Just stay alert. Let me know when you're moving again. The radio fell silent. For a long moment, she didn't move. She stood between the weight of the mountain and the weight of the unknown, the air thin around her, the camera heavy in her hand. Something deep inside the crevasse tugged on the frayed rope, a ghost of motion, or perhaps simply wind. And behind her, the solitary footprint watched over the silent slope like a quiet witness. Elena inhaled carefully, then made herself continue upward, each step deliberate, each breath measured. She secured the camera inside her pack, tightened every strap, and forced her thoughts back in order. She would study it later. She would study everything later. For now, she had to move. But as she climbed out of the couloir and rejoined the main incline, she couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen had been watching her. Something buried deep in the ice. Something that had waited 70 years for someone to find it. And now that she had, it felt as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The image of the footprint, the glint in the ice, and Daniel's troubled voice followed her upward, threading themselves into her thoughts like the first quiet notes of a story she had no choice but to follow. When she finally reached a more stable section of the slope, she paused again, not to rest, but because she felt, with quiet certainty, that this climb had changed. She had come to Everest seeking a summit. Instead, she had found a question, and she was beginning to understand that the mountain was waiting for her to answer it. The wind had strengthened overnight, though not enough to erase the details of what Elena had found. The glint of the camera in the ice, the frayed rope disappearing into the narrow fracture, the single footprint hovering on the edge of impossibility. As she left the couloir behind and resumed her upward progress the previous day, those images had followed her, persistent as the ache in her lungs. Even now, as she stood outside the tent of the high camp, that memory lived beneath her skin. She had slept poorly, drifting between shallow dreams in which voices whispered from deep blue ice, and the crevasse yawned beneath her like an open mouth. When she finally woke, the frost on the inner wall of the tent shimmered in the early light, forming shapes that might almost have been fingers. The camp around her stirred slowly as the other climbers prepared for the day. Metal striking metal, quiet curses muffled by oxygen masks, the soft hiss of stoves melting snow into water. Every movement was measured, every gesture conserving strength. High-altitude mornings were not lively affairs. They were silent negotiations between body and will. Daniel stepped out of his tent and gave her a nod. The skin around his eyes looked more strained than usual, as though he too had been thinking of the strange signal and the things she described only in fragments. "You all right?" he asked, adjusting the harness at his waist. Elena nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure the answer was true. "I want to go back down to the couloir," she said. "Not far, just to check the crevasse again. There was definitely something down there." Daniel hesitated. "The weather's turning worse. Forecast says this window closes fast." "I won't go deep," she replied. "I just need to see more clearly. If something from that old expedition is trapped in there, it matters. And if that signal came from the crevasse..." She let the rest hang in the cold air between them. He studied her for several seconds. The mountain reflected in his goggles made him look distant, almost unreal. Finally, he sighed. "All right, but you keep me on radio the whole time." They set out together, though Daniel stayed a short distance higher on the main route, keeping her within sight whenever possible. The ridge stretched away beneath her, wind-chiseled and treacherous. She descended along her previous day's tracks, each step stirring memories. When she reached the couloir again, the wind settled into an uneasy calm, as though the mountain were holding its breath. The footprint was still there. Most faint edges had been softened by the night's wind, but the central indentation remained unmistakably human. She crouched for a moment, tracing it with her eyes, wondering again how a single footprint could exist without a trail. The air around her felt colder, heavier. She pulled her attention away from the haunting question and moved toward the crevasse. The rope was still in place, a dark line vanishing into the ice. She checked her anchors, drove fresh protection into the wall above the fracture, and clipped herself with steady, practiced motions. Every action was calm, deliberate. She could feel her heart beating faster, but her hands remained steady. She radioed Daniel. "I'm going in a little, not far." "Copy?" His voice came back. "Keep talking to me." She eased herself closer to the narrow opening, shifting her weight onto her front points, gripping the ice with her axe. The crevasse breathed cold air up into her face, carrying the metallic scent of deep ice that had not seen sunlight for decades. When she leaned forward, the darkness swelled beneath her like an abyss. She lowered herself half a meter, then another, bracing her knees against the tight walls. The light from above flickered across the interior, casting blue and silver veins across the ice. Beneath her boots, the rope vanished into a dim shaft, where the color blue thickened into black. Something glimmered near her left hand. She steadied herself and reached out carefully, brushing away frost. It was a metal shard, the size of a coin, old and warped. She tucked it into her jacket pocket, then looked down again. The rope tugged faintly. She froze, gripping the wall. It wasn't a strong movement, more like the rope had shifted under its own weight, but the sensation crawled along her spine. Slowly, she reached down and touched the rope with her gloved fingers. It was still taut, unchanged from the day before, but her mind raced with images of something suspended below, trapped in the ice. A pack, a tool bag, a body. Her breathing became louder inside her mask, echoing in the narrow space. She made herself continue downward another few inches, angling her helmet lamp into the depths. The beam dissolved almost immediately in the blue haze. She couldn't see more than a meter below her feet, but the walls told a story of their own. Embedded in the ice were small fragments, threads of old fabric, a strap buckle, a metal ring. They had been caught here during some violent moment, someone falling, the ice shifting, gear torn away. Each piece felt like a word from a sentence broken long ago. A gust of wind swept across the couloir outside, and the sound funneled into the crevasse with a roar that made her flinch. Snow sifted down along the edges, dusting her helmet. She realized the walls around her were not completely stable. The mountains shifted constantly, breathing in its slow, geological rhythm. If the upper lip collapsed, even slightly, she could be sealed inside. "I'm coming back up," she said into the radio. "Good," Daniel answered. "Take it slow." She climbed out cautiously, testing each hold before trusting her weight to it. When she emerged into the couloir, the light felt almost bright after the blue twilight of the crevasse. She lay back briefly against the slope, closing her eyes. The wind brushed snow into thin spirals around her legs. Then something moved. She opened her eyes sharply. For a moment she thought it was Daniel, but he was far above her, a small figure on the main road. She looked down the slope. A shape, dark and vertical, had taken form against the wind-blown landscape. It lingered about 20 or 30 meters away, barely distinguishable in the shifting light. She blinked. The shape didn't vanish. It leaned slightly, as if bearing weight on ice axes. A human shape. "Daniel," she said quietly, not taking her eyes from the figure. "Is there anyone else en route with us today?" "No, just the two of us on this section." "Why?" "I see someone." Static hissed through the radio, filling the pause that followed. "Where?" "Below, near the couloir. I can't make out details." The figure didn't move. It stood as still as a cairn. The wind blew spindrift around its legs, but it made no gesture, no sign of awareness. "I'm going to call out." "Elena, wait." She cupped her hands around her mask and shouted, but the wind scattered her voice. The figure remained immobile. For a fleeting moment it looked impossibly familiar, an old photograph come to life, a silhouette from a bygone era. The wind surged again, lifting a veil of snow between them. When it cleared, the figure was gone. She scanned the slope, heart hammering. Nothing. Only the empty plain of wind-carved ice, unmarked except by her own tracks. She didn't trust her eyes, not entirely. At this altitude, shapes shifted, shadows deceived. But the clarity of what she had seen unsettled her in a way no hallucination had done before. "It's nothing," she said into the radio, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "Probably just a ridge shadow." "You sure?" Daniel asked. "Yes," she lied. She collected herself and began making her way back up the slope toward him. Her legs felt heavier now, Her mind pulled in conflicting directions. Logic told her that she was tired, hypoxic, seeing patterns where none existed. Yet the camera in her pack thumped gently with each step, as if reminding her that yesterday she had found something no one had touched for 70 years. Something that connected this mountain to a story unfinished. When she reached Daniel, he studied her expression through his goggles. "You okay?" "Yes," she said again, though the word rang hollow. As they climbed toward the high camp, the wind continued to rise, scouring the slope clean. But no matter how fiercely the mountain tried to erase the traces of what she had seen, Elena felt the memory settle deeper. The crevasse, the aged fragments of gear, the strange footprint, the fleeting silhouette in the whiteness, each piece was a thread drawing taut, pulling her back toward a mystery interred in ice. And somewhere inside that quiet blue abyss, preserved by cold and time, waited the truth of what had happened here long before she was born. She could sense it now as clearly as she sensed the weight of the pack on her shoulders. The mountain was not done with her, and the story trapped beneath the frozen surface was beginning, step by deliberate step, to rise. The wind battered the high camp relentlessly through the afternoon and deep into the night, rattling the thin nylon walls of the tents like a restless hand, shaking fragile bones. Even inside her sleeping bag, wrapped in layers of down and synthetic insulation, Elena felt the cold gnaw at her ribs and work its way toward the marrow. The storm was not yet catastrophic, but it was insistent, persistent, as though the mountain were warning the climbers that it held dominion and that any trespass beyond its routines would be paid for in some private, unspoken currency. By the time daylight crawled over the serrated ridges and spilled timidly across the frost-laden slopes, the wind had merely shifted from violent gusts to steady, deliberate pressure. The kind of weather that reminded climbers they were never, ever in control. Elena sat up slowly, disentangling herself from the layers. Her muscles were stiff, her head floated as though untethered to her spine, and her mouth felt as dry as if she had been breathing dust all night. She sat there for a long time, listening to the muted sounds of the camp awakening, aware that today she would have to confront the meaning of what she had found. Confront it not with the adrenaline haze that had guided her near the crevasse, but with the clear, cold logic needed for the next part of the climb and for whatever truth lay captured on that forgotten film. The camera lay bundled inside her pack like an artifact carried from another era. She touched it briefly, letting her gloved fingers rest against the outer fabric. A strange tenderness moved through her, a recognition not of the object itself, but of the hands that had once held it, the breath that had fogged its lens, the eyes that had framed the last images preserved within. She wondered whether the climber who'd held it had known he was near his end, whether he had pointed it toward something he hoped would never be lost, whether he had been aware, even in his final moments, that his story was falling not into oblivion, but into the deep, icy memory of Everest. Daniel's voice cut through the wind outside. "Elena, you up?" She zipped her jacket and crawled out into the brittle light. Daniel was tightening the straps of his pack, his breath flowing from his mask in thin, ghost-like streams. His expression was unreadable behind the lenses of his goggles, but his posture was rigid, as though coiled against some inner unease. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. "A little." She scanned the camp. Most of the team had retreated into their own concerns, repairing gear, checking oxygen levels, boiling water for the thin tea that passed as breakfast. "You?" "Not much." His voice was low. "I kept thinking about that signal, and about what you said you saw." She almost denied it, but the memory was too vivid to dismiss. "I saw a shape," she admitted. "A figure. Could have been a rock. Light distortion. Maybe even another climber we didn't know about." She paused, but it felt like a person. Daniel tightened his strap and straightened. People don't just appear and vanish at 8,000 meters. Not unless they're hallucinations. "I know what hypoxia can do," she said sharply. "This wasn't that." He studied her for a moment, then sighed. "All right, let's talk about the camera." They retreated into her tent, where she gently unwrapped the object from her pack. Even in the muted light of the nylon interior, the camera looked solemn, like a relic exhumed from an archaeological dig. The metal casing had lost much of its luster, and the scratches that lined it whispered of rough handling, perhaps a fall, perhaps desperate gripping. Daniel leaned in closer. "It's definitely from the 50s, he murmured. "I've seen pictures of similar models in alpine museums." Elena turned it delicately, careful not to trigger any mechanism. The camera felt oddly warm now, perhaps from her body heat seeping into the metal, or perhaps from the weight of the story it carried. "The rope tied to it," she said softly. "It wasn't frayed the way loose gear usually is after decades. It was preserved. Something is still holding it down there." Daniel's mouth tightened. "Most likely a pack, or maybe part of a harness. We can't assume it's anything else." "But we can't rule it out either," Elena replied. He looked away as though reluctant to acknowledge the possibility. "If a body's down there," he said eventually, "it's not coming out. Not from a crevasse like that. Not from that depth." Elena swallowed. She knew he was right. Even searching would be lethal. But she needed to understand what had happened. She needed to make sense of the fragments she had uncovered. "Let's look at the markings," she said. They examined the gnarled surface with meticulous care. The faded engraving of the year 1954 was unmistakable. Near it, half obscured by scratches, were initials. Perhaps 2 letters, perhaps 3. The first looked like a shaky M, the second like an almost erased R, though it could have been P. The third was too damaged to decipher. "I've heard of that expedition," Daniel said after a moment. "A small European team. I think one of their climbers was named Moritz, Morin, something like that. They attempted a northern approach that was considered too dangerous even then. They vanished. No bodies were recovered." Elena nodded slowly. The story surfaced in her memory, an obscure footnote in the mountain's grim history. If this camera belonged to one of them, then this is the first solid evidence of what happened to them, Daniel finished quietly. They sat in silence for a moment. The wind raked the walls of the tent, making the thin fabric tremble around them, as though the mountain itself disapproved of what they were doing. Elena reached out and brushed her fingers across the shutter lever, not enough to move it, just enough to feel the cold metal beneath her glove. "I want to open it," she said. "No," Daniel said immediately. "Not here. Not like this. The temperature's too low, and the humidity's wrong. You could damage the film." "I know," she exhaled slowly. "But I need to confirm there's something inside." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Just the back. Be careful." She worked the latch gently, feeling it resist at first, then give way with a dull click. She didn't open it fully, only a sliver, enough to see the faint glint of the metal spool inside. Her heart accelerated. The film was real, intact, sealed in the camera all these decades, surviving the fall, the cold, the shifting of the ice. She closed the back carefully and secured it again. "There's a whole story in here," she whispered. "A lost world." Daniel let out a long breath. "If we can get it down safely, maybe we can have it restored, developed." For the first time that morning, Elena felt a spark of something warmer than the sunless light, a kind of solemn excitement. She imagined the images frozen on that strip of film, faces grinning at camp, ropes being tied, frost in beards, the distant gleam of the summit. And perhaps in the final frame, the moment where everything faltered, the moment a mistake or a storm or a single misjudged step sealed the fate of the entire team. "We need to tell the others," Daniel said, "and the coordinator." "Yes," she agreed, "but first I need to show you something else." She reached into her jacket pocket and removed the small metal shard she had found in the crevasse. Daniel leaned forward, brows furrowing, as he examined it. The shard had once been part of a clasp or buckle, the metal polished from age and exposure. It bore faint traces of a maker's mark, old, obscure. But there. "This must be from the same expedition," Daniel said quietly. "A pack buckle, maybe." She nodded. "I also found fragments of fabric, a strap, and what looked like the corner of a map inside a small tin case." Daniel stared at her. "A map?" "Yes, but it was too fragile to retrieve safely, and the wind started shifting the snow above. I couldn't risk staying longer." He rubbed a hand across the side of his mask. "Elena, this is more than just some remnants. This is evidence of where they ended up, maybe even how they died." She looked at him steadily. And we can document it. We can at least give their families, if any are still alive, some closure. And the climbing community, too. We can finish their story. Daniel lowered his gaze. But we have to be realistic. We can't retrieve the bodies. We can't even retrieve the rest of their gear. Not without risking our own lives. I know, she said softly. I'm not thinking of going any deeper. But even as she said it, the memory of the blue abyss pulled at her, as though the mountain had whispered into her bones. She remembered the rope beneath her touch, the subtle tension that suggested weight, the way the fragments in the ice lined up like clues to a tragedy playing out in frozen echoes. After a moment, Daniel said, we should analyze the tracker logs. If the second signal came from the crevasse, we need to understand why. They made their way to the central tent where the expedition data was stored. The coordinator, a weathered man with ice-white stubble, glanced up as they entered. When they explained what they needed, he nodded, though skepticism twitched at the corner of his mouth. Still, he pulled out the device that recorded all positional data from their trackers and scrolled through their recorded logs. There, Daniel said, pointing. Look. On the small, grainy screen, two signals pulsed briefly in proximity, her own and another, fluctuating irregularly. Then, as though swallowed, the second dot disappeared instantly. The coordinator frowned. Could be an echo or a malfunction. Could be, Daniel said, but the timing matches the moment she reached the crevasse. They zoomed in further. The second signal didn't drift out of range. It didn't fade. It simply vanished, blinked off like a light extinguished abruptly. It was the pattern of a device that had momentarily powered on, then died, either from a depleted battery or sudden mechanical failure, or from being encased in dense ice that disrupted transmission. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with cold. The idea of a body lying down there, a person who had once breathed, laughed, dreamed, still wearing a pack that contained a tracker, it struck her with a strange, piercing sadness. She didn't romanticize their fate. She had seen enough mountain tragedies to know the line between ambition and mortality was always razor thin. But now, for the first time, she could see their path unfolding in front of her. Their final route, their final moment. I need to go back there, she said quietly. Daniel turned sharply. No. I need to document what I saw, the placement of the fragments, the direction of the map piece, the location of the buckle, not go deeper. Just photograph everything clearly so we can provide coordinates and evidence to the archives. Daniel looked at her for a long time. At last he nodded. All right, but I'm coming with you this time, and no risks. She accepted that. The storm had diminished somewhat, but clouds still swirled in unsettled patterns across the ridge. They would have to move quickly. Before they left, Elena slipped the camera into a padded pouch and secured it tightly in her pack. She touched it once, briefly, and felt the weight of the past settle over her like snowfall. As she and Daniel stepped outside into the thinning wind, she felt again that curious sensation that had haunted her since the moment she pulled the camera free, the sense that she had awakened something that had slept within the ice for decades. A story that had waited not just to be found, but to be understood. The mountain rose around them in austere silence, its slopes glittering with the sharp white sheen of ancient frost. Far below, the couloir stretched like a frozen scar across the face. The crevasse waited there, a dark seam in the pale expanse. And beneath its surface, in the depths where sunlight never reached, the remnants of a vanished expedition lay suspended in the ice, as though time itself had paused in that narrow chasm. Elena felt the pull again, a quiet, insistent tug. Not the lure of danger or the seduction of mystery, but something more solemn, an obligation. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in unfinished stories, and she believed that sometimes the mountain allowed those stories to surface, not as warnings but as threads of memory woven through the ice, waiting for someone to gather them. As she and Daniel descended toward the couloir, she tightened her grip on her ice axe, bracing herself against the gusting wind. The clouds drifted low and heavy, cloaking the ridge in shifting shadows. She felt small beneath the magnitude of the landscape, but she felt focused too, anchored not by fear but by purpose. This was no longer just a climb. It had become a dialogue between the living and the lost. And Elena knew that when she reached the crevasse again, she would be stepping not only toward a fracture in the ice, but toward the fragile threshold where past and present touched. She did not know yet what truth awaited her in the depths of that frozen memory, but she knew the mountain would reveal it piece by piece, fragment by fragment, like a photograph slowly emerging from the darkness. The descent toward the couloir began in a silence that was heavier than the packs on their shoulders. The sky had cleared somewhat, but not enough to reassure either of them. The clouds dragged across the ridge in slow, thoughtful movements, like enormous animals deciding where to settle for the coming hours. The thin light cast no warmth. It merely revealed the stark contours of the mountain, the serrated edges, the wind-peeled ridges, and the vast white slopes that hid entire worlds beneath their stillness. Elena kept her gaze fixed on the terrain ahead, watching every detail with the sharpened awareness earned only through exhaustion and trepidation. Daniel walked slightly above her, not quite leading and not exactly following, but maintaining a distance from which he could intervene if something went wrong. There was no need to discuss the plan. It existed in their mutual understanding, born at the intersection of fear, duty, and curiosity. When they reached the familiar depression where the couloir carved its path down the northern face, the wind eased briefly as though conceding the space to them. The air here carried a quiet, fragile tension, the sense of a place that remembered things, that harbored stories in its folds like pages pressed between stone. Elena paused on the threshold of the couloir, her breath quickening despite the cold, and looked down toward the crevasse she had visited twice before. From this vantage point, it looked unchanged, a narrow tear in the blue ice, waiting with the same patient stillness. Yet she felt something different in the air, something she couldn't articulate. Not danger, not exactly, but a weight, as though the mountain acknowledged her return. Daniel descended alongside her, slipping into the couloir with practiced ease. "Where did you see the fragments?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Just below the lip," she said. "They were embedded in layers of ice. Old layers." He nodded, tightening the straps of his pack. "Let's keep this quick." She didn't respond. Instead, she moved forward until she stood once again at the edge of the crevasse. The rope tied to the camera still disappeared into its depths. The snow around it had shifted slightly since the last time she was here, but nothing significant had fallen. That alone felt like a small miracle. She knelt and brushed away the loose frost, revealing the same dark hollow beneath. The familiar cold draft rose from below, smelling faintly of mineral and age. It was a scent she'd begun to associate with those early explorers, the breath of ice that had held their final hours for decades. As she anchored herself and prepared to lower into the upper portion of the crevasse, Daniel positioned himself above, checking the tension of the rope that linked them. "If anything feels unstable," he said, "you climb out immediately. Don't push it. There's documenting, and then there's unnecessary risk." "I know my limits," she replied, though she felt the tug of uncertainty beneath the confidence in her voice. Limits were strange things on Everest. They shifted like the wind. She eased herself down again, careful to move only as far as she had the first time. The interior looked the same, the blue walls shimmering with trapped air bubbles, the half-hidden fragments that glinted faintly under her helmet lamp. But something else caught her attention, an area farther down where the ice seemed darker, denser, as though objects deeper within cast a faint shadow through the layers. It wasn't clear, just a dim smudge of difference, but enough to kindle fresh questions. She reminded herself of the categories she had mentally prepared: observe, document, withdraw, nothing more. She angled her camera toward the buckle she had seen earlier. It was still there, delicately held by the ice, as though a single touch might free it entirely. She took several photographs, close angled, pulled back, capturing the way the strap remnant curled just beneath. Then she turned her light to the opposite wall, finding the small shred of cloth she had glimpsed before. Its fibers looked stiff with age, fused by decades of freezing and thawing. She photographed it too. Her pulse had quickened, but she kept her breathing even. Each flash of the camera illuminated tiny particles swirling inside the crevasse, like dust caught in sunbeams. though here the glitter was cold and crystalline. She began to move her light in a slow arc, scanning deeper into the crevasse, but the walls blurred into uniform cerulean darkness. "Elena?" Daniel's voice drifted down. "What do you see?" "Fragments," she said. "I'm documenting everything." "Good. Just remember we can't push farther today. Weather's unstable." She nodded even though he couldn't see her. "I know." But as she prepared to climb back up, the beam from her headlamp drifted downward again, almost without her meaning it to. The rope tied to the camera extended into that uncertain blue void, its end vanishing into some hidden depth. What waited below? The truth? A body? The final moments of those lost men? She felt the pull of the unknown, but also the responsibility of survival. She gripped the ice firmly and forced herself to begin the ascent. When she emerged into the couloir, breathing harder than she expected, the light above seemed harsh after the dim tranquility below. She steadied herself on her ice axe and looked at Daniel. He watched her with a mix of concern and relief. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she swallowed. "I got what we needed." He nodded, and together they moved away from the crevasse. As they walked, Elena felt an ache form behind her ribs. Not sadness exactly, but a strange sense of connection to the lost expedition. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been standing closer to their final moments than anyone since the day they vanished. The camera at her side felt heavier with each step, as though the film inside carried not just images, but emotions pressed into silver. When they reached a safer section of the slope, Daniel paused. "We need to decide what to do next." She understood. The mountain was darkening under shifting clouds. Weather would worsen. Their window was closing, and above them, the summit awaited, austere and magnificent, as though daring them to choose between ambition and obligation. "We can't go back into the crevasse," she said. "Not now, not again. It's too dangerous." Daniel exhaled, relieved. "Good. That's the right choice. But we have to record everything," she continued, "and report it. The coordinates, the evidence in the ice, the signal pattern from yesterday. Someone needs to know what's down there." Daniel nodded. "We can compile a full report when we get back to the lower camps. And when we return home, we can contact Alpine Archives and the families associated with the expedition." She was quiet for a moment. The wind skimmed across the ridge, swirling snow around their legs. "And the camera," she said. "We need to protect it at all costs. If the film survived, it could be the only direct record of what happened." He agreed. "We'll carry it down together. Make sure it stays warm. We'll ask the coordinator to store it with sensitive equipment until we reach base camp." Even with that plan forming between them, the decision to leave the crevasse behind left her with an unexpected heaviness. She looked back toward the couloir, its shadows thickening. Something about that place had changed her, not with fear, but with a newfound respect for the weight of history buried in ice. The mountain did not forget, even when people did. Their descent toward camp was cautious, broken by frequent stops as the wind shifted. Along the steep sections, the gusts kicked up loose snow that tried to swallow their tracks. Elena moved deliberately, her mind split between the climb and the thoughts unraveling inside her. The silhouette she had seen the previous day lingered in her memory like a half-finished sentence. She wondered whether it had been a shadow or a hallucination, or something simply too easily explained by the play of light. But deeper than that question lay another. Why had she felt so certain it had been a person? Some instinctual recognition, a human shape amid the blur of storm. She did not believe the mountain showed ghosts, but she believed it echoed lives lived and lives ended on its slopes. As they neared the high camp, the wind began to howl again, tearing at their clothing and scattering ice crystals against their goggles. Daniel gestured for her to hurry, and together they pushed through the final stretch. When they reached the tents, the coordinator met them with a grim nod. "Storm's coming in faster than expected," he said. "We might have to descend tomorrow instead of going for the summit." Daniel exchanged a glance with Elena, but neither spoke. The summit no longer felt like the singular purpose of the climb, not after what they had uncovered. Inside her tent once more, Elena removed her gloves with stiff fingers and carefully released the camera from her pack. She let it rest in her hands, the metal now warmer, almost comforting. She imagined the film curled tightly inside, holding secrets, perhaps mundane, perhaps profound. She imagined the climber who had taken the photographs, unaware of how close he stood to his own end. She imagined his fellow climbers stepping across crevasses, studying maps, crossing ridges that no longer existed in the same form. The past felt almost alive now, not as ghost or vision, but as a truth preserved in frost and waiting to be reclaimed. She took a deep breath and set the camera in the safest corner of the tent, wrapped in layers of clothing and insulation. Then she activated her headlamp and pulled out her notebook. She began writing the coordinates, the observations, the fragments she had photographed, the details of the second signal, the moment of its appearance and disappearance, the silhouette she wasn't sure she'd seen. She wrote not as a climber, but as a historian, recording the testimony of ice. When she closed the notebook at last, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her. They had done what they could. They had honored the dead by bringing their memory back to light. Whether the film revealed answers or only more questions, the story was no longer frozen in silence. As she lay back in her sleeping bag, listening to the wind claw at the tent walls, she allowed her eyes to drift closed. Despite the storm gathering outside, she felt a strange peace. The mountain would reveal what it wished in due time, and she would carry the truth down its slopes, step by careful step. Some stories were meant to be exhumed from the ice. Others were meant to be finished by those who came after. In the darkness of the tent, the camera lay silent, but its silence felt full of memory, of possibility, of voices waiting to be heard once more. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe, check out the next episodes, and share it with someone who might like it too.